The drawing-room of Hawthorne House gleamed under the soft halo of crystal chandeliers, their light refracted in the polished brass of candelabra and the sheen of the parquet floor. The scent of early summer roses drifted in from the terrace, mingling with the faintly perfumed air of evening coats and silk gowns. It was, in every respect, a house accustomed to refinement, to the quiet choreography of wealth and taste. And yet, as Inspector Roderick Alleyn would observe later, even the most polished rooms bear the invisible traces of tension. Lady Felicity Hawthorne, perched with habitual grace on the edge of a Louis XVI's settee, surveyed her guests with the easy condescension that belonged to those who preside over society. She had a theatrical flair for hosting, her eyes sparkling with faint amusement at her own wit, and a certain rigid precision in manners that suggested a life spent adjudicating small disputes and maintaining appearances. This evening, the room held a mixture of actors, aesthetes, and retired generals, a constellation of accomplishment and ambition that often disguised rivalries deeper than the most elaborate soirees could expose. In one corner, the aging diva of the English stage, Eleanor Vane, was the center of a delicate orbit. Her presence demanded attention, not by insistence, but by the quiet authority of reputation and cultivated beauty. Time had etched faint lines along her cheeks and shadowed the corners of her mouth, yet her gaze retained the incisive brightness of the prima donna who once commanded every theatre from Edinburgh to London. She was draped in a gown of subtle emerald silk that caught the light with each measured gesture, a fan in her gloved hand oscillating gently as she listened to the younger actors recount tales of new plays, rehearsals, and London gossip. Alleyn, had he been present at that moment, might have noted a slight tension in her shoulders, the brief flicker of impatience when a young actor laughed too loudly, or the way her eyes lingered on certain guests with a faintly assessing look, as though appraising not only their manners, but their intent. There was a subtle anxiety in the room, scarcely perceptible yet woven into the fabric of conversation, a tension between admiration and rivalry, respect and envy. Sir Geoffrey Linton, retired from the army, yet still commanding the space with the bearing of a man accustomed to obedience, murmured compliments to Lady Felicity about the arrangement of the room, his words polite, measured, but faintly mechanical. He was a man whose life had been regimented by order, duty, and discipline, and whose socializing now seemed to him a delicate exercise in formalities rather than pleasure. Across the room, the painter Oswald Wren lingered by a newly hung portrait of the diva herself, a likeness that was unflinching in its realism. Wren had an artist's peculiar attentiveness to observation, and one might have guessed that he was noting more than the surface. The subtle curve of a smile, the shadow beneath the eyelids, the stiffness of a posture that claimed nonchalance but revealed restraint. A hush fell briefly, when Lady Felicity rose to announce that the evening's feature would be a reading from Eleanor Vane's private memoirs. The room tilted slightly toward her, leaning on polite expectation, anticipation edged with reverence. The diva's voice, when she finally spoke, was a soft instrument, modulated, precise, carrying a subtle authority that belied the frailty of age. Her words danced lightly over the anecdotes of stage triumphs, the delicate grievances of colleagues past, the anecdotes of rival performers vanquished or applauded. Yet beneath the articulate delivery, Alleyn, if he had been observing, might have perceived the ghost of bitterness, a carefully veiled resentment that hinted at years of calculated survival, in a world that often celebrated youth above experience. Dinner was to follow the reading, and the social rituals proceeded with the precision of well-rehearsed theater. Glasses were refilled with sparkling wine, laughter punctuated the conversation, and yet a subtle, almost imperceptible undercurrent threaded through the interactions. A faint exchange of glances between two actresses, the slight tightening of a jaw, the polite yet evasive bow of a guest who had hoped to speak privately with the diva. All these were signals in a social language that, for those untrained, appeared nothing more than ordinary civility. By the time the guests had assembled in the small salon for post-dinner coffee, Alleyn would have had enough material to begin his quiet inquiry. The unspoken rivalries, the delicate resentments, the carefully maintained masks of civility that, when removed, might reveal fissures as sharp as the most obvious motive. In this house of elegance and memory, it was the unseen, the unvoiced, that carried weight. And it was precisely there, in the silent spaces between polished words and courteous smiles, that the story of the last confession was already beginning to unfold. The morning after the gathering arrived, with a calmness that belied the quiet horror soon to be discovered. Hawthorne House lay bathed in pale sunlight, the garden dew still clinging to roses and lavender, the air cool and almost indifferent. Within the walls of the residence, the household moved with routine precision, the silver trays polished, the breakfast table laid, and servants executing their duties with the discipline of long habit. Yet there was already a subtle dissonance, a sense of wrongness that refused to announce itself with noise or spectacle. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Coburn, a woman of restrained demeanor and unshakable routine, who first stumbled upon the still figure of Eleanor Vane. She had entered the diva's private study, a room of heavy draperies and lined bookshelves, expecting to find her mistress preparing for the day as she had for decades, reviewing correspondence or rehearsing lines aloud. Instead, the sight that met her was one of such quiet finality that her breath caught and her hand trembled against the polished oak desk. Eleanor Vane was seated, an open diary resting across her lap, her head tilted slightly as if in contemplative repose. The green silk of her gown caught the morning light in muted brilliance, and her hands lay relaxed, almost formal upon the pages. There was no struggle, no sign of physical violence, no scream had marked the hours of night. The room bore the same careful order as always. A half-filled teacup on the side table, spectacles lying askew on a blotter, letters stacked neatly. Even death had been approached with an almost ceremonial serenity. Mrs. Coburn, though seasoned in managing the eccentricities of her mistress, felt a chill of unease. The calm of the scene suggested deliberation, a quiet inevitability, as if the house itself had witnessed a secret decision made in the stillness of night. When Inspector Alleyn arrived, summoned by a terse, controlled call from Lady Felicity, he approached the study with that same measured poise which lent him an air of authority without alarm. The room was silent save for the occasional ticking of a mantel clock, a sound so ordinary it might have lulled a less attentive observer into complacency. Alleyn's eyes, sharp yet discreet, took in the scene with an almost casual precision. The posture of the body, the angle of the head, the subtle tension in the hands that betrayed the faintest resistance to surrender. He noted the absence of defensive gestures, the lack of evidence of intrusion, and the minimal disturbance of personal belongings. The tea remained undrunk, the diary open at a page whose words he did not yet read. There was an elegance in the scene that was almost ironic. Death as decorum, carefully timed and impeccably executed. It was the sort of demise that might have appeared unremarkable to an inattentive eye, but to Alleyn every detail spoke. A faint indentation where a ring had pressed into the wrist, the crease of a silk glove not quite aligned, the subtle smear of ink that suggested a hand once writing had ceased in mid-thought. Lady Felicity hovered at the doorway, her expression composed yet strained, as if the etiquette of mourning were an art she had mastered long before necessity. She observed the inspector's quiet survey with the patience of one accustomed to being quietly assessed herself. "She seemed so well last evening," she said softly, her voice almost swallowed by the room. "We had no inkling, nothing that suggested—" Her sentence faltered, the words lost in the awareness that the carefully maintained facade of the previous night had shattered without fanfare. Alleyn, gentle yet unyielding, replied only with a slight nod. He did not attempt consolation, for there was none appropriate. His attention remained on the minutiae, the careful arrangement of papers, the faint mark of lipstick upon a letter corner, the slight disturbance of the rug where a foot might have rested. All of it, he understood instinctively, was part of a rhythm now interrupted, the rhythm of a life governed by artifice, attention, and discipline. Outside, the garden shimmered with sunlight, yet Alleyn could almost hear the quiet echo of the previous evening, the laughter, the applause, the careful politeness masking ambition and resentment. Inside, the scene in the study suggested that the diva had chosen her own final curtain with the same artistry that had defined her career, and somewhere beneath the elegance, the silence held its own meaning, a secret that would not speak until it was forced, delicately, to do so. Inspector Roderick Alleyn arrived at Hawthorne House just as the mid-morning light was softening the sharp angles of the terrace, bathing the facade in a muted glow. He was received by Lady Felicity at the door, her composure impeccable, yet the slight tightening around her eyes betrayed a disturbance beneath her usual poise. Alleyn's entrance was deliberate but unostentatious. His hat held in his hand, coat buttoned precisely, an observer before he spoke, assessing before he questioned. The drawing-room, though familiar in layout from the previous evening, now seemed altered, as if the air itself had absorbed the quiet shock of death. Alleyn's gaze swept methodically across the polished surfaces, noting the placement of furniture, the subtle shifts in objects, the faint traces of human presence left in the morning's calm. His eyes rested on the portraits of previous Hawthorns, ancestors whose silent gazes seemed to appraise the current generation, offering judgment not in words, but in expectation. He began with the servants, not as an interrogation, but as a conversation lightly tinged with the authority of knowledge. Mrs. Coburn recounted the night's events with precision, revealing nothing, and yet, in what she omitted, everything. The briefest pause before acknowledging the discovery, the careful phrasing to avoid speculation. These were as telling to Alleyn as any hurried confession might have been. The housekeeper's loyalty was evident, her discretion meticulous. She spoke to protect, not conceal, and the inspector recognized the distinction immediately. Alleyn's next attention was to the guests who remained in residence or had been invited for breakfast, a small gathering convened by Lady Felicity's insistence that appearances, if nothing else, be maintained. Sir Geoffrey Linton, standing by the window with hands clasped behind his back, was the first to meet the inspector's eyes. His rigid posture, the precise tilt of his head, and the faint frown upon his brow communicated the restrained composure of a man whose life had been shaped by structure, yet whose mind was already registering the subtle perturbations of loss and suspicion. The painter, Oswald Wren, lingered near a table of morning papers, but his attention flitted constantly, taking in not the printed words, but the movements and expressions of others. Alleyn noted, with quiet approval, Wren's habitual attention to detail, the way he registered nuance in posture, tone, and gesture. A man trained, whether he realized it or not, in observation. Finally, the inspector's gaze turned to the immediate family and close associates. Lady Felicity's niece, Miss Clarissa Hawthorne, attempted a composure that betrayed nerves. Her lips curved in a socially expected smile, her hands folded with careful elegance. Yet the quick glances she exchanged with the maid at the window, the small tremor when a teacup rattled upon its saucer, revealed a mind unsettled. Alleyn did not question her directly at first. Instead, he allowed her to reveal herself in the space between actions, a strategy he had perfected in years of observing the interplay of propriety and concealment. Alleyn's method, as always, was patient. He moved through the room as if part of the furniture, speaking only when necessary, leaving questions hanging like threads in the air, waiting for the answers to present themselves through natural slip, involuntary gesture, or carefully hidden tension. He noticed the subtle inconsistencies, the slight stiffening of a shoulder as someone mentioned the previous night, the minutely delayed response to a polite inquiry, the fleeting glance toward the study where Eleanor Vane had last been seen alive. These small signs, nearly imperceptible to the untrained eye, were Alleyn's primary evidence. There was also the interplay of memory and habit. He observed the teacups already arranged, the silver gleaming, the cushions precisely fluffed, routines maintained even in the wake of death. Such continuity, so ordinary to others, spoke to him of character and of the capacity for concealment. The house itself was a stage, its residents actors trained in subtleties, and Alleyn watched the performance unfold with gentle but unwavering scrutiny. By mid-morning, Alleyn had formed a quiet inventory of tensions, rivalries, and loyalties. Each person's demeanor, every inflection and hesitation hinted at hidden histories. No question had yet been pressed, yet each guest had begun, inadvertently, to betray themselves. The inspector's mind worked silently, assembling the fragments of human behavior with the meticulous patience of a painter layering fine strokes upon a canvas. He left the drawing room for the study once more, not yet ready to confront the household with direct inquiries. The scene of Eleanor Vane's final moments waited in quiet testimony, unspoiled, eloquent in its restraint. Alleyn sensed that the answers would emerge gradually in the soft fractures of politeness and the faint shadows cast by propriety. He understood, as he often did, that in houses such as this, the truth rarely shouted. It whispered, and only, to those who listened attentively. Alleyn began his conversations with the household in a manner characteristic of his approach, courteous, understated, and attentive to the silences as much as the words. There was no urgency in his tone, no hint of alarm. The gravity of Eleanor Vane's death was conveyed, if at all, by the deliberate attention he paid to each speaker. In such a refined environment, the measure of truth was rarely found in immediate confession, but in the careful misalignments between speech and demeanor. Miss Clarissa Hawthorne was the first to be questioned. She sat with her hands folded upon her lap, her fingers interlacing with a tension she seemed unaware of, her eyes bright yet flickering with unease. Alleyn's voice was gentle. "Miss Hawthorne, you were close to your aunt. Could you describe the evening as it passed, from your recollection?" She answered politely, recounting the social intricacies of the gathering with precision. Yet each sentence bore a subtle hesitation when mentioning Eleanor Vane's mood. She praised her aunt's wit, her composure, and her command over the room, but failed to note the slightest signs of vexation, though Alleyn had already observed them. Her omissions were as revealing as any statement. Sir Geoffrey Linton, meanwhile, exhibited a different pattern. Alleyn engaged him beside the window, speaking of generalities at first. The evening, the arrangement of guests, the positions taken by actors and painters alike. Sir Geoffrey responded with a formality that bordered on ritual, and yet his eyes, wandering to the study where the diva had been found, betrayed curiosity mingled with something sharper. A fleeting shadow of disapproval, perhaps, at the very presence of artistry in a space he had once known to be governed by discipline and order. His words were impeccably courteous, but their careful neutrality suggested that his mind was cataloguing silently all perceived transgressions. The painter Oswald Wren, in contrast, was almost too observant. Alleyn spoke with him near the portrait of Eleanor Vane, and Wren's eyes followed the inspector's movements with a keen intensity. "The reading," Alleyn said softly. "You were present for the memoir. What did you notice?" Wren's reply was measured. He had noticed mannerisms, inflections, the tension beneath a smile, but nothing overt. Yet in the subtext, the slight hesitation before certain names, the way his gaze shifted when recounting passages of the memoir, there lay a subtle undercurrent of judgment. Wren's mind, trained to record nuance, had retained everything. Throughout these interviews, Alleyn allowed silences to speak. He observed the faintest corrections in posture, The briefest avoidance of eye contact, the imperceptible tightening of lips when certain topics arose. When a guest failed to mention a particularly delicate remark or omitted the presence of a minor figure in the gathering, Alleyn noted it. The human mind, he knew, was rarely as careful in concealment as one might believe. In its very efforts to maintain composure, it revealed its private truths. Lady Felicity, when approached, spoke with calm authority, her voice a soft echo of the same controlled performance she had employed in hosting the previous evening. She described the sequence of events politely, with minute attention to propriety, but each answer bore the mark of conscious selection. Alleyn listened, letting the information settle, parsing the significance of words left unspoken, gauging the spaces in conversation where fear, loyalty, or perhaps guilt might reside. Even the servants, so skilled in discretion, revealed insights through the smallest slip. A hesitated reply, a diverted glance, a pause too long in recounting routine movements. Alleyn's questions were unobtrusive, but he noted patterns. Who lingered in which room, who passed by with extra care, who lingered near the study without apparent reason. Each detail formed a lattice upon which the truth could eventually be suspended, subtle yet persistent. By late afternoon, Alleyn had not yet interrogated anyone in the conventional sense. No accusations had been made, no confrontations occurred. And yet, beneath the polite facades and elegant evasions, he had begun to perceive the faint outlines of character-driven motive, the interplay of admiration, envy, and loyalty, so delicately interwoven in the fabric of Hawthorne House, was gradually revealing its texture. Alleyn understood, as he often did, that the answers would arrive not in confession, but in the imperceptible fracture lines of social grace, where civility wavered under the weight of truth. Alleyn's attention, as always, was drawn not only to the grand and visible, but to the small and overlooked. The servants of Hawthorne House moved with disciplined grace, their eyes trained to conceal, their voices carefully modulated, yet in their habitual silence lay a quiet power. The inspector knew well that a household such as this carried within it fragments of truth, held in reserve by loyalty, discretion, or simple fear. Mrs. Coburn, seated with her hands folded neatly upon her lap, had already recounted her discovery of Eleanor Vane in the study, but Alleyn noticed that she hesitated ever so slightly when asked who last saw the diva alive. The pause was a nearly imperceptible shift of weight, the faintest flutter of eyelids, and yet Alleyn's trained perception caught it. "You are not obliged to tell me more than you know, Mrs. Coburn," he said, voice low, almost conversational. But sometimes the smallest detail, overlooked by others, proves most instructive. The housekeeper's eyes met his, calm and measured, and then briefly darted to the other end of the room where a young footman lingered in shadow. Alleyn made no comment, allowed the silence to stretch, and in that quiet, the unspoken passed between them like a message folded in air. Mrs. Coburn resumed her narrative with careful neutrality, describing routines of the night, movements of staff, and the general tranquility of the household. Yet in what she left unmentioned, certain doorways traversed, doors left ajar, hushed voices beyond the drawing room, Alleyn read the faint outlines of secrets preserved through habit and discretion. The footman, Thomas by name, was less skilled in concealment. He approached Alleyn, hat in hand, head slightly bowed, as if balancing respect with trepidation. "Sir, I might have seen something, perhaps, but I was unsure." His voice trailed off, uncertain. Yet his gaze flicked involuntarily toward the study where Eleanor Vane had spent her final hours. Alleyn inclined his head. "Uncertain is often wiser than hasty certainty, Thomas. Tell me only what you are certain of, however small it may seem." The boy's eyes brightened, and in a whispered recounting of minor household movements, who passed where, when lamps were extinguished, Which doors remained open? He revealed the skeleton of events that would otherwise have remained invisible. The butler, Mr. Hargrove, proved the most disciplined of all. Polite, almost immaculately neutral in his responses, he offered little yet revealed much in the rhythm of his speech. He described the meal service, the positions of cups and trays, the routines performed with military precision. Yet Alleyn noticed that when mention was made of Eleanor Vane's private habits, a subtle tightness appeared about the jaw, and a faint hesitation touched his words. Alleyn made no note aloud, allowing the servant to complete his account, but inwardly catalogued the anomaly. In these exchanges, Alleyn observed the layers of social allegiance: loyalty to the mistress, adherence to routine, a careful fear of impropriety. All were in evidence. And yet in the subtleties of glance, posture, and delay, each member of the household revealed a fragment of knowledge withheld. Nothing was malicious, nothing deceptive in intent. Rather, it was the natural preservation of dignity, the careful maintenance of appearances that so often mask the truth in households of this kind. Even as the servants departed to resume their duties, Alleyn remained in the quiet of the study for a moment longer, considering what had been revealed. The minutiae of their movements, the faint discrepancies between recollection and observed fact, and the delicate tension in their voices, formed a lattice upon which a wider understanding might be constructed. He recognized that the household itself was an accomplice of circumstance, not in malice, but in discretion, a silent custodian of secrets that only he, through patience and perception, might interpret. Alleyn rose finally, straightening his coat and smoothing his hands over the polished wood of the desk. He understood that the servant's silence was not obstruction. It was a reflection of their world, a world in which restraint was both moral and practical, and where truth was measured in nuance rather than proclamation. And in that understanding, he gathered the first threads of insight that would gradually, inexorably, lead him closer to the heart of the mystery. Alleyn returned to the study in the late afternoon. Alone this time, the house quiet except for the faint rustle of curtains stirred by a hesitant breeze. He allowed himself a careful examination of the surroundings, not merely to observe the scene of death, but to understand the minutiae of Eleanor Vane's daily life, the rituals and routines that had defined her existence for decades and which now might conceal the faintest whisper of motive or premeditation. His attention was drawn first to the open diary lying across her lap. The ink was faded, the handwriting neat, deliberate, and at times almost ornamental, looping gracefully across the page. But Alleyn noted a slight smudge on one line, the result of a hand lingering too long, pausing in thought or hesitation. It was barely perceptible, yet to him it suggested the interruption of a habitual movement. A hand accustomed to precise gestures now halted. Whether it had been the result of emotion or something more deliberate, he could not yet say. On the small side table, a silver teacup, partially emptied the night before, remained. Alleyn observed the angle at which it had been placed, not the habitual exactitude of Eleanor Vane's morning ritual, but slightly askew as though arranged by a hand in momentary distraction or absent-minded deliberation. A teaspoon lay across the saucer, its polished surface catching the light in such a way that even the smallest imperfection in placement was evident. To most eyes it would have seemed trivial. To Alleyn, it was a subtle deviation, a crack in the otherwise perfect facade. He moved next to the bookshelves, noting their careful organization. Volumes of memoir, theater history, and the collected plays of her career were aligned with precision. Yet one small volume, a thin collection of sonnets, protruded slightly, as if disturbed the previous evening. Alleyn did not touch it, merely catalogued the irregularity. The smallest shifts in routine, he knew, were often the first signals of the extraordinary hidden beneath the ordinary. His gaze then fell upon the framed photograph on the mantel. Eleanor Vane in the prime of her career, smiling with effortless charm beside a fellow actor, whose name had long ceased to be spoken in polite conversation. There was a faint layer of dust along the edges of the frame, except for the narrow streak where it had evidently been touched repeatedly, almost ritually. Alleyn considered the gesture. A habit of memory, perhaps, or a faint symbol of affection, regret, or lingering resentment. The hand that traced such a pattern was capable of precision, yet could also be stirred to uncharacteristic, decisive action. Alleyn also noticed the subtle traces of yesterday's rehearsal of the memoir. Reading the placement of the chair, the slight indentation of the carpet where she had stood, the careful arrangement of her notes. There was nothing chaotic, nothing disturbed. Yet these repeated gestures, the habitual actions of a woman who had spent decades performing for audiences, revealed patterns, and in patterns, he knew, there might exist the seeds of deviation. Even in death, Eleanor Vane's life was measured and controlled, and the slightest anomaly in that control was a clue. Finally, he observed a small, inconspicuous object on the writing desk, a fountain pen, its cap slightly askew, its nib still glinting with residual ink. It was not unusual to leave a pen uncapped after writing, yet in the context of Eleanor's habitual perfectionism, the placement struck Alleyn as irregular. The pen might have fallen, been replaced hastily, or held in a hand whose intent had been interrupted. Here, in the mundane, lay the faintest indication that the orderly rhythm of the diva's life had been punctuated, by design or by accident, in the hours before her death. Alleyn stepped back and allowed himself a moment of reflection. The room, the objects, the precise rituals, all spoke to a life of discipline, of meticulously maintained appearances. And yet, in their subtle disruption, they whispered hints of emotion, tension, and human fallibility. He understood that the clue he sought was not in the loud gestures of crime, but in the quiet, deliberate deviations of a life lived with extraordinary attention to detail. And somewhere in those deviations lay the first trace of a path he would follow, a path that would lead him, with patient observation, closer to the truth of Eleanor Vane's final hours. The following afternoon brought with it a quiet disruption, small in sound but significant in implication. Hawthorne House, accustomed to its routine of measured civility, was unsettled not by violence or clamor, but by a minor incident whose subtlety was enough to set the household on edge. Alleyn, seated in the drawing-room with papers and notes before him, observed the ripple of reactions with his customary restraint, noting every shadow, hesitation, and unspoken concern. It was Miss Clarissa Hawthorne who first precipitated the tension. She had received a folded note, delivered with careful discretion by the footman Thomas, and opened it with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Alleyn watched from across the room as her fingers trembled imperceptibly, as if in recognition of the note's import. She glanced toward Lady Felicity before glancing again at the paper, the faintest flush coloring her cheeks. There was no outcry, no dramatic gesture, but the atmosphere shifted. The subtle fracture of composure in one guest created a ripple across the others, each perceptive to the smallest change in demeanor. The note itself was elegantly penned, unsigned, and contained only a brief message, a reference to a detail of Eleanor Vane's memoir reading, a phrase deliberately ambiguous, yet enough to suggest that some aspect of the evening had been misremembered or misrepresented. Its tone carried neither threat nor accusation, yet in the deliberate selection of words lay an insinuation, a nudge toward reflection or unease. Miss Clarissa's handling of it, careful, uncertain, deliberate, revealed more than the note itself could have conveyed. Alleyn made no immediate comment, allowing the household to process, while he noted every subtle flicker of expression and posture. Sir Geoffrey Linton, upon noticing the young woman's momentary discomfort, inquired politely after her welfare. His words were measured, courteous, yet in the slight tightening of his jaw, the faint quiver of impatience at a perceived breach of order, Alleyn discerned a mind attuned to disruption, however minor, and ill at ease with ambiguity. He recorded inwardly the subtle interplay of authority, restraint, and latent judgment, traits which, in different circumstances, might color motive or action. Even Oswald Wren, ostensibly detached, betrayed a brief shift of attention, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Clarissa. Alleyn observed the painter's habitual precision in noticing minute detail, recognizing that Wren's interest was not mere curiosity, but the careful assessment of human response, a silent measurement of tension, loyalty, and anxiety. It was in such observances, Alleyn knew, that the psychology of the household would ultimately reveal itself. Lady Felicity maintained her composure with enviable grace, though even she could not entirely mask the subtle disturbance caused by the note. Her hands, gloved and composed, rested lightly on the arm of her chair, yet Alleyn noticed the fleeting tightening of her fingers and the faint shift of her gaze toward the study. She had long mastered the art of social equilibrium, but equilibrium, like all constructs, was susceptible to imperceptible stresses. Alleyn himself refrained from intrusion. He allowed the household to absorb the subtle disruption, to act in ways revealing of character rather than calculated deceit. The note, simple and quiet as it was, had produced a cascade of micro-reactions, a small collapse in the rigid choreography of behavior, an invisible tremor sufficient to illuminate hidden anxieties. In the space of polite conversation, in the subtlest adjustment of posture or gaze, the contours of motive and opportunity began to emerge. By evening, the atmosphere of Hawthorne House had changed imperceptibly but irrevocably. Civility remained, but it was tinged with caution. Politeness persisted, yet unease lingered beneath its surface. Alleyn, seated in the quiet of the study once more, catalogued the faint shifts of tension, the ripple of psychological consequence from a note that said little, yet implied much. He understood, as always, that the resolution of such subtle disturbances demanded patience. The truth in this household would emerge not in an outburst, but in the gradual unraveling of routine, ritual, and the careful facades maintained by its inhabitants. As evening descended over Hawthorne House, the air seemed to thicken with unspoken questions, subtle anxieties, and the weight of observation. Alleyn had spent the day in quiet reflection, moving through rooms with the deliberate slowness of one attuned to nuance, cataloguing behavior, gestures, and small inconsistencies that others scarcely noticed. In the drawing room, the household continued its polite routines, yet the faint tremor of unease was now omnipresent. Alleyn seated himself by the window, allowing his gaze to drift across the garden, the hedges neat, the roses still vibrant under fading light, and he began the work that required neither questioning nor evidence alone, assembling character, gesture, and silence into a coherent pattern. Each guest's comportment, Clarissa's subtle hesitations, Sir Geoffrey's rigid adherence to order, Wren's vigilant observation, Lady Felicity's poised tension, formed a lattice upon which he could perceive motive and potential. The truth, he understood, would emerge not from the dramatic or the obvious, but from the accumulation of these quiet signals. He recalled the slight smudge on the diary page, the misaligned teacup, the fountain pen cap left askew, each a deviation from Eleanor Vane's meticulously ordered world. Such disturbances, minor though they appeared, were meaningful precisely because they contradicted the routines she had long maintained. A woman accustomed to controlling perception, to orchestrating every gesture, leaving even a tiny imperfection, suggested either distraction, coercion, or a deliberate act interrupted by circumstance. Alleyn considered all possibilities with patient rigor, resisting the temptation to prioritize one over the other before all observations were integrated. The household's reactions to the ambiguous note had further clarified his sense of internal dynamics. Clarissa's small, nearly imperceptible blush and tightening of fingers, Sir Geoffrey's subtle impatience, Wren's narrowed scrutiny, Lady Felicity's restrained composure, all signaled awareness of unseen pressure. In a family and household so attuned to etiquette and the preservation of dignity, even the slightest ripple in comportment revealed deeper currents. Fear, loyalty, resentment, or knowledge held with careful discretion. Alleyn's skill lay not merely in observation, but in interpretation. He understood, instinctively, the rhythm of relationships, the cadence of influence and affection, the quiet marks of rivalry under the veneer of civility. In this house, where theatre, art, and disciplined propriety intersected, human impulses were as carefully choreographed as a stage performance. Yet beneath the choreography, subtle fissures had begun to form, fissures visible to one who observed patiently, without need of confrontation or alarm. He reflected upon the micro-reactions he had witnessed, Clarissa's eyes flicking toward the study, her lips pressing together when questions touched upon the memoir. Sir Geoffrey's glances at the slightly displaced teacup, the brief quiver in the hand that held it. Wren's scrutiny of gestures rather than words, his instinctive cataloguing of tension. Lady Felicity's control over posture and voice, masking an almost imperceptible disturbance. Individually, each might appear insignificant. Collectively, they suggested a landscape of subtle anxiety, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but precise and meaningful to Alleyn's trained mind. By the dimming of the day, he understood, with the calm certainty that often accompanies such quiet revelation, that the puzzle of Eleanor Vane's final hours would yield less to evidence of overt action and more to careful reading of character. The ordinary motions of the household, the minor deviations from routine, the hushed reactions to a carefully worded note, all were instruments of disclosure, singing softly in a language only Alleyn could translate. He rose, smoothing the lapels of his coat, and allowed himself a moment's appreciation of the quiet efficacy of his method. The pieces were aligning imperceptibly, like dust settling over a table of instruments. Nothing yet revealed, nothing yet confessed, but a pattern, delicate yet undeniable, beginning to form. In this house of elegance, of precision, and of carefully maintained social order, Alleyn sensed that the culmination of observation, intuition, and patience would soon converge. The truth was near, though still hidden beneath the layers of ritual, silence, and civility. Alleyn, having spent the day absorbing the nuances of Hawthorne House, elected now for a more direct, albeit discreet, approach. He requested to speak privately with Miss Clarissa Hawthorne, the young woman whose gestures and hesitations had suggested the deepest entanglement with the tensions surrounding Eleanor Vane's final hours. The request was framed politely, without urgency or accusation, and she consented with an apprehensive grace that betrayed her awareness of unspoken scrutiny. They moved into the library, a room of muted warmth and soft shadows, where leather-bound tomes and polished oak conveyed the discipline of order and the quiet authority of intellectual tradition. Alleyn closed the door with care, preserving an atmosphere that was calm and non-threatening, the way a conductor might guide a hesitant soloist through a complex passage. He did not begin with a question, but allowed a few moments for the young woman to settle, to fill the space with her own presence, however measured. "You are naturally distressed," Alleyn began, his tone conversational, the calm weight of observation underlying his words. "The events of the past 24 hours have unsettled all of us. Yet there are matters which, if discussed, may help restore a sense of clarity, for yourself and for those who must understand what occurred." He spoke not to provoke confession, but to offer the possibility of reflection. Clarissa's hands remained folded, her gaze lowered, and Alleyn allowed silence to press gently, knowing that the mind often revealed itself more fully in stillness than in hurried explanation. At last she spoke, softly, almost inaudibly. I received a note yesterday, she said, her voice faltering, and it reminded me of something I ought to have remembered before. Alleyn inclined his head slightly, encouraging, without urgency. Take your time. What comes to mind, however small, may be significant. Her eyes met his, wide with the tension of realization. It was about the memoir reading, she continued. A line she had intended to read differently. I knew she had practiced it, rehearsed it countless times, and yet, last night she changed it. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now, in retrospect, perhaps it was a message. Alleyn listened, noting the careful choice of words, the subtle oscillation between uncertainty and recollection. He did not interrupt, nor did he offer judgment, but catalogued every inflection, every hesitation, every trace of anxiety that betrayed her proximity to the underlying truth. She was meticulous, always, Clarissa added, her fingers tightening briefly. Every gesture, every movement, every word was calculated. Yet that night, there was a pause, a deviation. I cannot explain why I noticed it, or why it now seems so important. Alleyn nodded, making no comment beyond a slight, courteous acknowledgement. The significance was clear to him. The deviation was not merely theatrical, but a subtle signal, possibly intentional, possibly accidental, yet meaningful enough to illuminate hidden dynamics. For a long moment, neither spoke, and the library seemed to contract around them in shared, quiet understanding. Alleyn's presence was neither threatening nor intrusive, but his attention was unwavering, a gentle force that encouraged reflection without coercion. Clarissa, sensing that her observations were valued, began to articulate more details. Small gestures, slight anomalies in household routine, the faintest deviations in behavior that had gone unnoticed by others but were now, in her recounting, luminous with implication. When at last the conversation drew to a natural pause, Alleyn inclined his head. You have been observant, Miss Hawthorne, and your recollections are precise. Continue to note the small things, the gestures, the patterns. They will reveal far more than rash statements ever could. For now, let us proceed with care and composure. The house is attentive to subtlety, and so must we be. Clarissa nodded, relief mingling with lingering apprehension, aware that she had spoken under the protection of his calm, discerning presence. Alleyn left the library with a measured step, aware that the day's observations, combined with these private insights, had crystallized a clearer understanding. The household continued in its outwardly serene manner, yet beneath that polished surface, subtle fractures had begun to reveal themselves, patterns of tension, loyalty, and suppressed emotion that, with patient attention, would lead him inexorably closer to the final unveiling. In a house governed by etiquette, the truth would emerge not in clamor, but in deliberate, quiet revelation, like a portrait emerging slowly from shadow. The following morning, the household gathered in the drawing room once more, ostensibly for tea and the gentle resumption of ordinary routine. The air, though still polite, carried the faint undercurrent of anticipation. The measured tension of yesterday had not dissipated, but Alleyn, ever mindful of decorum, chose his moment with deliberate care. He had observed, reflected, and allowed insight to settle like dust before he would speak, knowing that the revelation would carry more weight when presented with restraint. Alleyn began without flourish, standing near the fireplace, his presence calm and assured. The past day has offered many observations, he said softly, his gaze sweeping the room, resting briefly on each face, measuring composure and restraint. It is remarkable how much the ordinary routines of life, when observed closely, can reveal about human character and intention. There was no accusation, no sharpness, only the quiet authority of perception. He paused, allowing the weight of silence to settle, encouraging reflection rather than defense. The guests shifted subtly, glances exchanged without words, as if all were aware that the moment of understanding had quietly arrived. Eleanor Vane's final hours were marked by a subtle deviation from her habitual meticulousness. Alleyn continued. A change in gesture, a pause in routine, a minor alteration in movement. To most, inconsequential, yet to those trained in observation, deliberate in its significance. Clarissa, seated near the window, stiffened imperceptibly. Sir Geoffrey's jaw tightened in habitual restraint. Even Lady Felicity's composed expression bore the faintest trace of expectation. Alleyn did not rush, but allowed the household to recognize that he was speaking not of speculation, but of insight derived from careful attention. The deviation, subtle though it was, pointed to one who understood the precision of Eleanor Vane's life, yet was capable of acting within its rhythm without immediate detection. Alleyn said, his voice even, almost conversational. I have observed the household, spoken privately, and noted the patterns, gestures, silences, and reactions. The individual whose conduct aligns with these observations, whose subtle knowledge, enabled manipulation of circumstance, is Miss Clarissa Hawthorne. A faint, collective intake of breath passed through the room, though no one spoke. Clarissa's hands tightened in her lap, her lips pressed in a delicate line, and Alleyn did not need to witness denial. The truth had always resided in the minute deviations he had catalogued, in her quiet attention to detail, and in her interactions with others. You acted without malice, without intent to harm, but with an understanding of influence and control. Alleyn continued, his tone soft yet precise. You were aware of Eleanor Vane's habits, her meticulous management of her household, and you acted in a moment where small intervention produced significant consequence. Your involvement, though subtle, was critical, and it is only through careful observation that it could be discerned. Clarissa's eyes met his, a mixture of apprehension and acknowledgement. I did not mean for it to... I only wanted... Her voice faltered, and Alleyn allowed the pause to speak for her. There was no spectacle, no dramatic confession, only quiet realization and the acknowledgement of consequence. Alleyn inclined his head, gentle and formal. The truth is often quiet, Miss Hawthorne, and in houses such as this, it emerges not in outcry, but in subtle fractures, in gestures, in the careful attention of those who observe. It is now understood, and it is accepted. The room remained still, civility preserved, yet the clarity of understanding suffused every corner. The revelation had occurred not with confrontation, but with gentle illumination, allowing the household to maintain dignity even in the face of quiet culpability. As the household resumed its semblance of routine, Alleyn noted the enduring elegance of human decorum, the capacity to accept truth, to acknowledge error, and to move forward, even when the consequences had been silently wrought. The mystery had been resolved, not through spectacle, but through the careful, deliberate patience that marked both investigator and household alike. The days following Alleyn's careful revelation passed with the measured rhythm of Hawthorne House reasserting itself, though a faint undercurrent of altered perception remained. Life, in its customary civility, proceeded. Tea was served with the same precision. The piano in the drawing room was touched lightly by practiced fingers, and the scent of roses lingered in the corridor. Yet the household now carried the invisible weight of acknowledgement. The truth, quiet as it had been unveiled, had settled into its place like a faint, persistent shadow. Miss Clarissa Hawthorne maintained her usual demeanor in public, yet Alleyn observed the subtle transformations that occurred in the private hours. Her walk through the corridors was more measured, her gaze occasionally lingering on objects that had once seemed unremarkable. The slightly askew teacup, the faint smudge on a diary, page, the portrait of Eleanor Vane, whose eyes seemed to regard her with gentle reproach. There was neither despair nor dramatics, only the tempered awareness of consequence and an almost tangible, internal reckoning that no polite conversation could fully articulate. Sir Geoffrey Linton resumed his habitual oversight of household order with unaffected formality, yet Alleyn noted the faint tension in his hands, the occasional tightening of lips when Clarissa's name was mentioned. Authority, when exercised in a home of etiquette, often concealed a deeper awareness. Sir Geoffrey's adjustments were subtle, protective of civility, yet informed by his perception of fragility and potential risk. His own measure of justice was not public, but internal, an equilibrium preserved by observation rather than confrontation. Oswald Wren, the painter, returned to his canvases, yet there was a slight restlessness in his gaze. His study of human character, so crucial to his work, now encompassed a new layer: the quiet orchestration of error and consequence, the subtleties by which action and inaction interweave. Alleyn, aware of Wren's perceptiveness, understood that the painter's judgment, silent and private, would become part of the ongoing landscape of social reckoning within the house. Lady Felicity, ever the anchor of propriety, maintained her serene composure, orchestrating the household with the grace and authority she had always displayed. Yet even she, whose influence extended through courtesy and order, could not entirely mask the shifting undertones of awareness. Small adjustments, a gentle redirection of conversation, a subtle realignment of seating arrangements, were sufficient to preserve dignity while acknowledging the invisible currents now flowing beneath the surface. Alleyn himself observed all this with the detachment of one accustomed to human subtlety, recognizing that justice in households governed by civility rarely manifested as punishment alone. It was often found in acknowledgement, in the measured calibration of behavior following insight, in the quiet reconciliation of error with consequence. The irony, as ever, lay in the delicate interplay between action and decorum. The most significant truth had emerged not through confrontation, but through reflection and the disciplined attention of those attuned to subtlety. In this environment, punishment in the conventional sense was almost irrelevant. The acknowledgement, the careful internal reckoning, the social awareness of consequence. These were sufficient to ensure that the integrity of the household, and of those who inhabited it, remained intact. Alleyn's presence, his calm discernment, had allowed the delicate balance to endure even as the invisible scales of understanding had shifted. There was no spectacle, no dramatic justice, only the quiet, inevitable alignment of awareness with truth. And so Hawthorne House continued in its refined, controlled manner, yet imbued now with a tempered recognition that civility could coexist with error, that elegance need not preclude consequence, and that the quiet revelation of truth often carried its own inescapable weight. Justice had been served, not with force, but with subtlety. The irony lay in its very quietude, a measured reckoning that honored the principles of decorum, even as it addressed the deepest currents of human behavior. The sun was low upon the grounds of Hawthorne House, casting long shadows across the neatly clipped lawns, the roses and hydrangeas shimmering in their late afternoon glow. Alleyn, having taken a brief walk through the garden after the morning's subdued gatherings, paused by the fountain, its waters murmuring with gentle insistence, and allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The case, though resolved, lingered in the mind like a subtle fragrance, delicate yet persistent. He considered the paths by which truth had emerged, not in confrontation, accusation, or dramatic revelation, but in the delicate interplay of gesture, hesitation, and observation. A misplaced teacup, a smudge upon a diary page, the faintest pause in a rehearsed movement. Each had whispered secrets to those who had eyes to see. It was a reminder, Alleyn thought, that human nature rarely speaks loudly. It prefers nuance, understatement, and the invisible currents beneath civility. Clarissa Hawthorne, Poised now in the drawing room with the careful grace of someone who had reconciled awareness with consequence, had displayed no theatrics, no overt emotion. She had been, in truth, the subtle instrument of disruption, and yet her actions had sprung not from malice, but from the fragile, complex tendencies of human attentiveness. Justice, in this household, had been measured not in punishment, but in recognition, a principle Alleyn had long observed in houses governed by etiquette and disciplined habit. The other members of the household moved through their routines with elegance intact. Lady Felicity's serene authority continued to govern the rhythms of Hawthorne House. Sir Geoffrey's composure preserved the veneer of order. Wren returned to his paintings, studying human nature with quiet curiosity. And through it all, the quiet knowledge of consequence, acknowledged without spectacle, lingered beneath the surface like the faint echo of a distant chord. Alleyn, standing beneath the tall oaks that lined the garden, allowed himself a private observation that the human heart, like a garden, requires attention, patience, and careful cultivation, yet is never entirely predictable. The smallest deviations, the minor shifts in routine and demeanor, carry truths far more enduring than words or confessions. In this, Eleanor Vane's life and death had offered a lesson both subtle and inexorable. He looked once more toward the fountain, its waters reflecting the amber light of the setting sun, and felt the quiet satisfaction of understanding achieved, through observation rather than force. The elegance of human behavior, its vulnerabilities, its delicacies, and its intricacies, had guided him to resolution. There had been no need for dramatics, no sudden confrontation. The truth, as it always does, had revealed itself to those patient enough to see. Alleyn turned back toward the house, his figure tall and calm against the fading light. Within the walls of Hawthorne House, civility persisted, tempered by awareness. The mysteries of gesture, routine, and subtle human psychology remained as intricate as ever, but for the moment they had yielded to patient observation. And in that yielding there was a quiet triumph, not of authority, but of comprehension, of the mind's capacity to discern the hidden patterns of human life and to witness the inevitable unfolding of truth with courtesy, reflection, and, above all, restraint. As he stepped along the path toward the drawing room, Alleyn allowed himself a small, inward smile. The world, with all its elegance, faults, and delicacies, continued, and he remained its gentle, unobtrusive observer, quietly assured that the truth, like the reflections in the fountain, was now settled, serene and unmistakable.